So, executing workflows during peer review for transparency, reproducibility, and reusability is the title that I chose for today. In the slide deck you find online, comes later, but I just pushed it up a little bit to make a connection to why I think what I'm going to tell you is actually connected with data documentation and metadata, because in my view and also in my experience, the best data documentation that you can have is reproducible research. So when you share everything, then people might not be able to, or you might not be able to create perfect metadata, but if you share your code, people can really dig into that. And I'm going to tell you about two projects and initiatives where I'm involved, where we try to take a closer look at computational workflows and code and the data as part of peer review. So let's start again briefly with the problem, although we already heard the term reproducibility crisis. So the foundation of the problem, or the core problem, is that researchers use computers. And they do that more and more because computers can help us answer questions which would otherwise be too hard to investigate. And the first problem is that with our own laptops, we do not have lab procedures like the two gentlemen here probably have in this little video. We do not handle our computers like we handle a biology wet lab. There are no procedures for note-taking or safety goggle wearing. We simply turn on our computer and expect it to work. But the collaboration with our digital tools is not always frictionless, and software usability plays a trick on us to believe that computers are stable and reliable, when in fact our digital tools are more like a house of cards. That is not a problem of the scientists alone, because our virtual laboratories have grown a lot in complexity over the last years, but we do not pay enough attention to them, as I think. The archaeologist Ben Marwick wrote this very interesting article, How Computers Broke Science and What We Can Do to Fix It, and I can recommend to take a look. In the article, he finds that modern research became too complicated and complex, but the means of communication, the journal article as the PDF, that just stayed the same. So but this article limits our capabilities to fully communicate all methods we used or created and all decisions that we made. So there is really a breakage in scholarly communication that is becoming more and more apparent and problematic. The way we communicate our work prohibits transparency, reproducibility, and reusability. So for too long, we sort of simply said, look, this is what we did. We basically showed fellow scientists our screens so they could look at our work, but they couldn't look into it. And reviewers also rarely evaluate data and code because of a lack of time, skills, or guidelines. And no talk about reproducible research is complete without Klebert's claim, I think, who nicely summarized the whole situation for computational research. An article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It is merely the advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions which generated the figures. So this is very important. My talk is about computational reproducibility. I don't have any experience with reproducing chemistry experiments, physical experiments, but I think considering that most researchers today probably use computers in some form or another and have some kind of data in the broadest sense, who can really say that they do not do any computational research at all? So I recently came across this fun meme on Twitter where we see like the person is not really happy with having access to the online tool to help exploring the data, which is a good intention by the authors. But what's really interesting and really worth it is actually giving me the data. And I would extend that to not only give the data, but actually give access to the code, the computing environment, and the documentation. So even though there are many personal benefits for reproducible works, sharing the whole package is still seen often as additional work. And the initiatives that I'm presenting now hopefully convince you that it doesn't have to be additional work, but it's actually worth doing. So if you have concerns about this, sharing everything that you have, I look forward to your questions after the talk. So I'll make this very brief because Jessica already introduced us to this crisis narrative. Sometimes it can be debated what kind of crisis we have, and every scientific discipline might face a slightly different kind of crisis. So we also might talk about a credibility crisis or replicability crisis. I do like the article by Daniele Fanelli, though, where he asks, is science really facing a reproducibility crisis, and do we need it to? So I think we can also address the situation that science sort of fell behind a little bit in using our tools, digital tools and digital data, and we need to catch up to make our work more reproducible again, because irreproducibility is rarely something that's out of bad intentions, but more often just something where the system doesn't give incentives or encouragement to work in a reproducible way. So when I say reproducible, I follow this definition that's nicely summarized by the Turing Way book on reproducible research that everybody should know. And I recommend you take a look at that. Here reproducible means that we have the same analysis, the same method, really the same code as the original authors, and we try to execute the same workflow on the same data set. And then there's other terms, namely replicable, robust, and generalizable, who vary if I use the same or different data, or the same or a different analysis. So it sometimes seems like reproducible research and peer review are not getting along. They might even like suspiciously eye each other. If software is so important for science, why is it largely neglected during peer review? The easiest answer, as I said, is that it's extra work, not only for the author, but also for the reviewer. But I think it's worth noting that the lack of reproducibility during peer review is just one of many challenges that science faces. And we'll maybe take that on in the discussion. It's unclear if we can solve the reproducibility problems without also tackling even larger issues that we have in science about evaluating researchers and metrics, for example. So my important message for today that I want you to take home with you is that reproducibility is something that we actually can and should have in a peer review process, and that's also something that we actually can solve. If you think there's something we cannot solve, I look forward to your question. So let's start with the first community-led initiative that I'm involved with. It's called CodeCheck. CodeCheck is motivated by the already mentioned breakage in science. We do not share all the building blocks of research, but we communicate effectively via something that could be a printed document. This prohibits reuse and collaboration. It's simply ineffective, and at the end of the day, it's a waste of money. So a CodeCheck means that a single person, we call it the code checker, is able to execute a computational workflow at one point in time using the material provided by the author. The code checker should not get any relevant errors when they do it, and they should get results that are not contradicting the original results. But it doesn't have to be perfect. This is by design a very limited scope. It places little burden on the authors because they share what they have, what they've already implemented, and it puts the trust in the person, the code checker, instead of requiring complicated infrastructure or technological experiences. Just like peer review puts trust in the researchers as reviewers. So this CodeCheck scope gives us flexibility, and we don't need like specific standards to follow or specific infrastructure. But just as I said, with peer review, we trust researchers to evaluate each other's workflows. So CodeCheck is built on 5 principles. First, CodeCheckers record but don't investigate or fix. Often enough, CodeCheckers do fix things, but then it's sort of an extra, and they do it because they enjoy doing it and it's fun, but we don't demand it. Second is communication between humans is key. I'll come back to that in our lessons learned. Third is credit is given to code checkers. That's very important for us. CodeCheck does work without public peer review. It can just be tagged on to double-blind peer review. But for us, this when it comes to code, we found that anonymity is really very hard to achieve and also not feasible. And that also leads us to the idea that we need to give credit to the people who contribute code reviews just as much as we give credit to the people who contribute regular reviews. And the fourth principle is workflows must be auditable, which means that sort of it's the author's task to make the workflow reproducible. And the fifth principle is that code check is open by default and transitional by disposition. Sorry. What do we mean with that? We are fine if code check disappears in 5 years because executing workflows is just part of what we normally call peer review. Just as you could say, reproducible research and open science are sometimes seen as funny terms because science should always be open. We should always be reproducible. We acknowledge the fact that this might just be a phase that we are going through to catch up with the way that our research changed. Then at the end of the process, if the workflow could be executed and the errors were not too big and maybe just small numerical differences, the code checker can say, yeah, the code works and the original paper gets a little badge. And we also publish a certificate that we share in a citable way with the DOI. And up to today, we have created 30 such certificates, and you can take a look at all of them in our register. A code check can be implemented in many ways. It can vary depending on the existing procedures of journals or community practices. It can not only happen at different points in time or varying degrees of openness and power of importance, but it can also be completed by different roles. Especially early career researchers could be excellent candidates to be introduced to peer reviewing this way. More importantly, they often have the required up-to-date expertise in technology and a large interest in learning methods and not just evaluating them. And the learning experience is one of the main motivations that we are told by volunteer code checkers. And I can personally totally confirm that if you reproduce somebody else's code, you always learn something, and it's generally a very interesting and great exercise. Yeah, about the variations, just maybe showing, mentioning one extreme and the other. We can have a code check in a public peer review where the code checker is from day one publicly known and communicates openly with, maybe even openly on GitHub with the author. And the code checker could be a software expert, but we could also have the other extreme where the code checker is staff with the publisher and is not named because they're just paid to do the job. So as you can see, we're not too hard with our own principles there. If you want to learn more about CodeCheck, we have a preprint out that's well, under peer review at the moment, and we've just prepared the revision, and you can learn everything about the project there. The next steps with CodeCheck, just that you get an idea of where we are with the project and what we want to achieve, is that you can get involved today, especially if you are a reviewer or an editor at a journal and you think that, well, this journal could actually do better when it comes to taking a look at the data and the code of papers. But we're also looking for volunteers to work as code checkers, or if you're an author and you have a paper that's reproducible, we are very excited if you get us involved in a conversation with your handling editor to maybe do a code check of your paper as part of the peer review. So we have written a paper about our ideas, but the next step, and that's really a tough one, is that we are looking to build partnerships with journals so that CodeCheck becomes part of publishers' workflows, which is really hard to do. And you can read more about what we've achieved and what the problems there are in our paper. We of course want to grow the CodeChecker community, although the problem right now is we don't have like a long waiting list of papers who need to be checked, because we are just building these collaborations with journals. There are a few who are really interested, but as you could maybe derive from our principles or from where our mindset is, they're also we would not be willing to work with every publisher, let me say it that way. We are also looking forward to collaborate more on education around reproducibility, because I think that if we mentor people to conduct code checks, that could be a great way to provide another way to learn more about reproducible research to existing initiatives such as ReproHack, for example. And ideally at some point in time, we want to have a code check editor who works full-time to make code checks happen for Diamond open access journals. So that's why we're really looking for more journals to collaborate with. At this point, I'd like to make a very small excursion with you because as I'm talking a lot about software, and I think research data is only half of the story. And because the question of who actually has the skills to do a code check and has the skills to evaluate software is really strongly connected with larger challenges around research software. So if in the code check paper, we ask ourselves the question, who has time for more peer review? Because we admit that doing code checks is more than we did maybe 10 years ago. And I think the answer lies in tapping into unused potential of research software experts. So in personal development, there is the concept of T-shaped skills. You might have come across that. It means that you have at the vertical bar, you have the deep knowledge, expertise and skills within a specific field. But you also have the horizontal bar, which means that there is broad knowledge across disciplines that you need this knowledge to collaborate with other experts and to apply your knowledge outside of your own field. That's more a traditional view on scientists. Today, we need more this. This is actually the capital Greek letter pi, which is why this concept is also called pie-shaped skills. So besides the deep knowledge and the broad knowledge, you also need a method skills, so computer skills. So that's about skills about reproducibility, statistics, programming, what's often called data science. And if you are a modern scientist and you work a lot with digital tools, you really need to have these two vertical bars to support your work. So one example that I often use, but I didn't come up with that, is that we describe the need for more professionalism around research software is the one of cooking. So we can all prepare food and so that we don't starve, or we can order food and we will have something to eat. But if we want to feed a lot of people effectively, or if we want to get the best food that we can think of, we go to the professionals. We go to the canteen at the university, or we go to a really nice restaurant if we want to celebrate a special occasion. We don't just do that at home. And that should be the same case with research software. If we want to have great software, which I think we need to do great research, we need experts who really have the time and expertise to create this software. And we need to question a little bit the home growing of research software that sort of the scientific system is currently forcing researchers to pursue. There's a bunch of organizations who follow this idea and build on this idea. And these are the research software engineering organizations. And I've put up here a few links to the German Research Software Engineering Association, the EASE, and also the UK and the international version. So if you've not heard about research software engineering, click on these icons to find out more. And also what I like to ask, because I think in other talks, the Nationale Forschungsdateninfrastruktur, the National Research Data Infrastructure, was mentioned in this week. That I would like to put the question out there: where is the German research software infrastructure? And I think we really need that. And if you want to get to speed around what is needed to turn research software into first-class outputs of research, just as we need to do with research data, or are making progress on doing that with research data, I recommend to take a look at these papers about an environment for sustainable research software in Germany, which is also the first position paper by the German Association of Research Software Engineering, and really a short second paper that's called Recognizing the Value of Software, a Software Citation Guide. Okay. Just needed to get that out there, even if it's the research data management, and I get the chance to talk a lot about software. That's nice. Okay, now back on track. Besides CodeCheck, I also have the honor to be involved with an initiative called Reproducible Agile. Agile is the name of a association of geographic information laboratories in Europe. That's where the Agile comes from. And it's a small community conference, around 200 to 300 participants that happens yearly. And it has, I think, around 60 or 70 member labs all over Europe, where the GI science community comes together and exchanges their research. I'm part of this community, and at the Agile conference is the first conference I went to as a student, where I presented like my first little paper, and it was great. And it really is one of these conferences where you go to and you don't miss. It happened now virtually twice. You don't miss anything that's happening in the research, but I really miss the people there. And this is sort of the great, also the reason why this conference was a great venue for us to try to push the discipline a little bit more towards reproducibility. So it started all with a couple of workshops in 2017, where we tried to talk about reproducible research, and there were just, from the 200 participants, just I think 3 or 4 showed up. So the topic wasn't really high on the list of people's lists. But out of this workshop grew a little meta research project where we assessed the reproducibility of papers published at the Agile conference. And based on this collaboration, we had a few more workshops and eventually were able to create or collaborated to create the reproducible publication guidelines for Agile. And based on these guidelines, we now have completed 2 reproducibility reviews as part of the conference. And I will introduce now the reproducible paper guidelines and also what experiences we made in these reproducibility reviews. But first, one step back, I said we made an assessment of reproducibility. Up to today, we assessed over 100 papers of the 2 major community-led conferences. So here on the left-hand side, you see a couple of figures based on the Agile paper dataset that we analyzed. And on the right-hand side, you see the results of the assessment of the GI Science Conference, which is the second large conference in our field. So we assess papers using a rubric of 5 categories with 4 levels. And for both conferences, we found that none of the papers, even just looking at the information provided, would have been reproducible at the point of publication. So when you think in these nice graphs, you sometimes see in reproducibility papers, sort of we have this big stack of papers, and then we split it up into reproducible, not reproducible, and we had none in the reproducible stack, even just reading the information that was there. So in case for the Agile conference, we also surveyed the reasons that authors gave why the paper didn't end up being reproducible at all. And major barriers that the authors mentioned were legal restrictions and lack of time, but also lack of tools, knowledge, and incentives. So we used the same rubric again on GI Science conference papers with similarly dire results. Again, no single paper reached level 3 in our rubric, which means that the data and the software is available and openly deposited with a permanent identifier. So if you would put your data and your code on Zenodo and get a DOI, you would have scored 3. In the data, if you look at the graphs, you see a couple of spikes here for the method section and also for the results. So that's the blue and the orange columns, the second and the fifth subgraph of both. The third and the fifth subgraph. And if you have a 1 in methods and results, that means that basically when we read the paper, we said, yeah, we understand what the authors did and we understand how they came to their conclusions. So that's maybe not too bad that we have this, can at least paint that picture that the research was communicated well and understandable, but it's not reproducible. So the Agile Reproducible Paper Guidelines, created by the Agile Reproducible Agile Initiative, their goals or their focus areas are transparency. So we want to just be transparent about it. If data is shared or not, if software is shared or not, these guidelines are mandatory to follow, but the most important sentence is right on the first page. Full and short papers submitted to the Agile conference have to include a data and software availability section which documents data, software, and computational infrastructure to support reproduction, or mentions reasons for not publishing them. So you're still free not to share your data and code. You just have to be transparent about it. And with these guidelines, we want to promote reproducibility. And we also want to acknowledge that there's a spectrum. And in some cases, yes, it is not possible to share everything. There might be good reasons for that. And there are. And we also try to focus these guidelines on the GI science community. So, for example, we try to come up with guidelines for sharing what data that is collected on OpenStreetMap, which is often used in our domain as a database for analyzing, for example, street networks, and how you can handle that. So a very quick look through the guideline document. So it starts with it's with a reproducibility checklist. Then we have author guidelines so that the author knows how they can create or shape their work in a way that's very reproducible. Then we also have guidelines for both the regular reviewer and the reproducibility reviewer and some background information. So this is actually the one-page checklist that we came up with that authors can go through before they submit the paper, or ideally before they start their work. But we all know how it is. We often just think about the conference where we publish at the end of a project, and information about how to write this data and software availability section. Then we have a few guidelines for data, and we've split this up into minimum requirements and recommended practices. And this means that if you, at minimum, you share all the data that you can share, and recommended practice would be that you also do that in a standardized format with the required metadata, for example. We also have guidelines for computational workflows. These are a bit more complex. And here we also have minimum requirements and recommended practices. And these are just a lot of ideas and ways that you can make your research more reproducible and hopefully also interesting to use for other disciplines. We also came up with scientific reviewer guidelines, trying to make clear the role that the regular scientific reviewer plays in comparison with the reproducibility reviewer, who also has here some information, what we expect and also what we don't expect reproducibility reviewers to do. So you see a lot of overlap here with the CodeCheck initiative. Actually, the Agile reproducibility reviews are also deposited to the CodeCheck register because the Agile reproducibility review adheres to the 5 CodeCheck principles. Just a couple of examples for do's and don'ts of reproducibility reviewers is that we do want to shift the burden to the author. If the author is not interested, we're saying, okay, then thank you. We hope next time you consider making your workflow a bit more reproducible. And the second example is that we do want to encourage authors and we do want to get them to work in a more reproducible way. And we try to set good examples for that. And also that we want to report the work that the reproducibility reviewer does. So we're also writing a little certificate in the end to really make clear that the work that went into giving the feedback about the workflow. So the review process, in this case, the reproducibility review happens after the accept or reject decision was made. That also allows us to openly communicate with the authors because they already know that, yeah, my paper is accepted. And it also takes into consideration that this is a volunteered community conference and really organized as solely based on volunteers. So how does this look like? We now have this proceedings page, and you see there on the right-hand side, next to the paper titles, this little Agile reproducible badge. And if you go to the paper landing page, you have another badge, and this link actually, if you click on that at the bottom here, you actually are taken to the reproducibility report, and we even have a little badge at the bottom of the first page, and that's really great because we have this was done by our publisher Copernicus, who put a lot of work into making this part of the conference work for us. So the reproducibility review results in 2021, just so you get an idea, we have I think 17 papers, full papers accepted, and we only looked at those, and we were able to reproduce 9 of them. And the problems that we had that prohibited reproductions were that there was no starting point in the paper. The documentation was simply not enough for a third party to reproduce something. And there's also a few papers that we accept that they are not reproducible because they are conceptual papers, right? We can reproduce conceptual papers by reading them and trying to understand them. And if they make sense, that's it. Sometimes data was not shared, and sometimes code was also not shared for good, or in my personal opinion, maybe not so good reasons. Yeah, I'll skip over this just so you get an idea how this report looks like. And also the great thing is that we can get these reports into your ORCID profile, for example. So this is our way of making sure that there is public credit for the reproducibility reviews. So as I mentioned, we started with this in 2017. Now it's 2021. So in just a few years, we were able to turn a conference that published irreproducible works into one that's talking a lot about reproducibility and debating what that means. And maybe that's useful for some of you, how you could achieve that in your own community. First step is that to try to build a team of enthusiasts. We did that through the workshop. And the second step is that you assess the current state and you raise awareness, which we did with another workshop and the paper that I mentioned. And when you make this assessment, people cannot really say that this is not a problem. And we were very lucky to find institutional support. There is the Agile Council, who heads the Agile organization, and we found support there. And that was really important for us as well. So if you want to have this kind of culture change, you really need people at the top who also contributed. It's really hard to drive this based solely on good intentions of young researchers. And we decided to completely go with positive encouragement, right? So we always make clear that if there's no reproduction, doesn't mean that it's bad science. It's just not reproducible, and there may be very good reasons that it is not reproducible, and you can make your own mind make up your own mind about that, because you can look at the paper, look at the data and software availability section, and then you will understand the reasons for why something is not reproducible. And then, yeah, you just have to keep at it. I'll skip these steps for the Agile conference and want to talk about what did we learn from the reproductions that we conducted as part of CodeCheck and Agile. So there's just a few highlights. I could talk about this for another hour. So we really see that there's a spectrum of reproducibility. And that also makes it not that simple to come up with step-by-step instructions for reproducibility reviewers, because every reproduction is unique in a way. But we can see an effect of the guidelines at Agile. There is improved reproducibility and there is community discourse, which I think is really important. The reproducibility reports or the CodeCheck certificates are full of recommendations for improvement, and often these recommendations are already taken up by the authors before the paper is published. And I think that's really awesome that through this review, we are able to improve the documentation and the data and the metadata of a workflow in a very effective way, because often enough, the code checker is just the first external person to really take a look at the details of a workflow. Also, good practices really spread slowly because people need to change their maybe even daily habits. So this also led us to Agile being less strict than originally anticipated. So it's hard to learn that this slow change can be a good thing because you can keep everybody on board. Like, we don't want to exclude researchers just because they might have a harder time catching up with the latest technological development that you might need. So the challenge for a reproducibility reviewer, I already mentioned some of those. It's really the biggest challenge I always find is that the lack of documentation. If I don't know how long a process that I'm starting will run, that really annoys me. And if there is no really good connection, no metadata, I could say, between the figure in the paper and the script in the repository, if I don't know which command creates which figure, that really sort of puts me off in the beginning. And it makes it really hard for people who produce something if they have to dig into every detail. And I think that's something that we can quickly solve as authors to guide our readers a bit more. But as I said, reproductions are really a rewarding and very educational experience, though matching the expertises can be a bit tricky. Communication between author and the reproducing reviewer or the code checker is without alternative. It's really hard to anonymize papers if one expert looks at another expert's paper anyway. And if you put in data and code, it's almost impossible to fully anonymize it if you really want to execute the workflow. And that's why we think we should just not even try to do that and create a code check in a way that it actually embraces the communication, because me asking the author like 1-2 quick questions is a lot more effective than the author trying to write the perfect documentation. He or she is likely to just miss the one question that I have, even if the documentation is massive. So if we just acknowledge that we need to talk about it, makes life easier for everybody. And also there are some limitations here. This is a safety net. So we can make sure that the code and the data that's provided, that it runs without errors, and that the images that it creates look similar to the ones in the paper. But of course, we're not at all checking if this all makes sense or if it's correct. That's just not something that we can squeeze into peer review right now. So we're providing a safety net. We're making sure that nothing really weird gets through, but we won't catch people who really have bad intentions. So the last couple of minutes, I want to mention what you can do today when it comes to reproducible research. And I hope there's a few researchers here who work with computers. You should familiarize yourself with a reproducibility spectrum that's created by Roger Peng a few years ago. And you should also use that to position yourself where you are now, and maybe use it to have goals that you can aspire to, and also maybe critically look at other people's work and have a vocabulary for communicating about reproducibility. Talking about vocabulary, a fun word that somebody created here is pre-producibility, because there was this confusion around what is reproducible, what is replicable. Philip Stark created an alternative. And it's a very short article that's worth reading, because it's not only a word, but it's also an attitude. And the attitude was summarized here in this tweet that I screenshotted. And the quote from the paper is, "Science should be show me, not trust me." And it continues, "It should be help me if you can, not catch me if you can." So if we would all work more with reproducibility as our goal and as our mindset, that would certainly help. Then I mentioned that working in a reproducible way doesn't mean that it's more work. And this is a really nice figure by Dan Quintana from the famous science podcast with the name Everything Hurts. And here he created this figure to compare a typical research project where you spend less time on the initial analysis, then go into peer review, and you have to redo things during peer review. Actually ends up being the same amount of work if you spend more time on the analysis in the beginning, making it reproducible and effective, then go into peer review. You will actually be a lot more effective to make changes and adjustments. And I'm also convinced of that. You will be much more convincing in stating your case for the reviewers than you are if you provide an irreproducible analysis. And one thing that I can recommend as well is that when you want to work more reproducibly, you try to find the champions in your domain. And everything that I know and all papers that I know about reproducible research in different domains I've put into a website for our university, and you find it here at this short link bit.ly/RCR in, so reproducible computational research in different domains. So hopefully you find something in there for hydrology, ecology, psychology, engineering, or social science. There's a bunch of different works. And I'll skip over those. And another thing that you can do today is that you take it slow, you take off the pressure, and you just take one step at a time to become more reproducible with your work. One good way is to create and publish research compendia. There's a bunch of more links on this website, researchcompendium.science. You can become a code checker or repro hacker and get practical experiences, or you can join a Reproducibility for Everyone workshop. These are organizations who run excellent events and really are the driving force behind education around reproducibility. And you can yourself strive to be an open science champion if you're junior in your field. And there is a great Riot Talk, which is another YouTube series of talks that I can recommend by Gavin Buckham that really brings home this argument. So try to build small communities. And also, I tend to say, don't rely on to those in power, because your PhD supervisor, if you're an early career researcher, might not know how things work these days because they've built their career at a different time. So what can communities and institutions do? I'll also just pick one or two things out of here, and you might take a look at that later so that I can sum up within my 45 minutes. Communities and institutions need to talk more about shortcomings around reproducibility, and you can introduce reproducibility reviews or code checks even at your own labs in your collaboration with other researchers. Just go across the corridor and ask, can you try to execute this workflow before I submit it? And you'll have a much more reproducible workflow afterwards, and you can return the favor later. And if you are in a position at a journal where you can make these kind of policy changes, try to start the conversation with your fellow editors. Because even if we take tiny steps, we still make progress. And as this dancer shows us, you can still be very powerful and graceful, even if it's small steps. So I'll skip over the vision and thank you for your attention. And let's do a quick recap. Researchers use computers and they use them a lot. We need to make sure that despite our reliance on complex digital workflows, the research still fulfills science's basic requirements for transparency, reproducibility, and reusability, even if we are skeptic. And you and your fellow researchers can be skeptical, yet still embrace the idea of pre-producibility and go beyond just showing what you did to sharing and collaboration. And the reproducible agile and code check initiatives demonstrate that code execution can and should be an integral part of peer review. But of course, there are many moving parts to achieve the culture change we need, and many related structural challenges for academia that are barriers to higher reproducibility, such as broken metrics, publication bias, insufficient retraction practices, et cetera, et cetera. You can do your part for your own work as a community leader or in collaborations, and open workflows are the best documentation that you can have. You should stay positive and be kind about this whole thing. Reproducibility is not about blame, and irreproducibility is very rarely misconduct, but only a sign for bigger issues and for people maybe just have to up their game in their reproducibility skills a little bit. And we can work towards fixing those by working towards reproducibility as well. So tiny steps still move us forward. More reproducible research is better research. And I thank you all for your attention and look forward to your questions.